Hi, I'm Olivia from Classroom 42, and today I'm doing a full exam walkthrough for AQA GCSE History, Paper 1, Section B. In this video, I'll be doing an exam overview, a walkthrough of each question type, some Grade 9 example answers, and some exam questions for you to try at the end as well. So, for Paper 1, as I would have mentioned in my previous video, it is split into Section A and Section B. So Section A will focus on your period studies, and then in this video we're going to look at Section B, which focuses on your wider world depth studies. So this could be either the First World War, the interwar years, East and West, Asia, or the Gulf and Afghanistan, depending on what your school teaches. For Paper 1, so that's Sections A and B, it is a written exam that is 2 hours long. It's 84 marks and it was worth 50% of your GCSE. So let's take a look at the exam question types. So for this section, you have 4 different question types. Question 1 will be an analysis of a source, which is worth 4 marks. Question 2 will be looking at how useful are the sources, and that is worth 12 marks. Your question 3 will ask you to write an account of, and that will be an 8 marker. And then your final question will be a how far do you agree, which is worth 16 marks, and you also do get 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar for this question. Right, so let's take a look at question 1. So this first question will ask you to analyse a source, and this is worth 4 marks. This will be a standalone source and won't be the same source that you're looking at in your question 2. So this question will normally tell you if the source is supportive or critical of a theme, for example an event. And it'll ask us, how do we know this? To achieve full marks for this question, you need to write 1 paragraph that includes the following. First of all, evidence. You need to highlight relevant features of the source's content and or the provenance. And the provenance is that bit at the top of the source that tells you a little bit of information about the date and the author, maybe a bit of background about the author. Next, you need to explain. So you need to explain why these features of the source show that it is either supportive or critical of the theme in the question. And then finally, you need to bring in some own knowledge. You need to support your explanation by using your historical knowledge and understanding. Remember, this question is only worth 4 marks, so keep it brief with 1 paragraph. So let's take a look at an example question and answer for this one. For this video, I'm going to be focusing on the conflict and tension in the East and West topic, but all the exam technique will cross over with whichever topic that you study. So here is our example question. So the question is, source A is critical of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's telling us that it's critical. How do we know? Explain your answer using source A and your contextual knowledge. So already it's giving us a bit of information, so we already know that it's going to be critical of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we need to explain our answer using details from source A, and we also need to bring in our contextual knowledge. So here is our source. Feel free to pause the video if you want to have a bit of a closer look. But basically it's an American cartoon that was published in 1962, and it shows Kennedy and Khrushchev and reads, "Let's get a lock for this thing." And then that reads nuclear war. So showing that it's basically like a monster trying to escape. Okay, so let's look at our example answer for this question. So you can see here I've just written 1 paragraph for this question because that's all we need. So first of all, you need to give your evidence. So this is, what does the source say that shows that it is critical of the Cuban Missile Crisis? So we want to make sure that we're sticking to the question and we're focusing on how we know the source is critical of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we go straight in with, I know that the source is critical of the Cuban Missile Crisis because it shows Kennedy and Khrushchev looking very worried, trying to hold the box labelled nuclear war shut. The nuclear war inside of the box is shown as a monster that has almost escaped. So we're just giving a bit of detail from the source. You don't need to go overboard with this. Just kind of pick out the key bits of the source that show why it is either critical or supportive of whichever topic your question is asking you about. Then we need to explain. So we need to explain why this shows it is critical. So this shows the crisis as dangerous and nearly uncontrollable, suggesting that both leaders were scared and struggling to prevent disaster. A very critical view of how close the world came to nuclear war. So we're showing how that shows that it is critical. So next we need to bring in our own knowledge, so we show the examiner that we know a bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the USA discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed on Cuba. The crisis lasted for 13 days and brought the world the closest it had ever been to nuclear war. So just rounding it off with a bit of our own knowledge, and that is going to get you 4 out of 4 marks. Okay, so for this next question is question 2. This is asking us how useful are the sources in relation to a particular theme. So this question will look at 2 completely new sources, so it'll be source B and source C. And these sources, one will be a text and one will be an image. So your text source might be like a newspaper article, a diary entry, something like that. And then your other source will always be an image, so it could be a political cartoon, a photograph, a drawing. So that's kind of the things that you need to start recognising already. As soon as you see your sources, it's really good practice to just identify what it is, which gives us a bit of information about kind of, the purpose of the source. So for this question, it is worth 12 marks and you should write 3 paragraphs. So your first paragraph can focus on source B, your second paragraph can focus on source C, and then your third paragraph, which is sort of giving your judgment on how useful are the sources, you want to focus on sources B and C together. So often the conclusion that you might come to is that, the sources are fairly useful individually, but together they're really useful for historians studying the topic. So you can structure your paragraph 1 and 2 as follows. So first of all, you want to give your evidence. So what information does the source give you that is relevant to the inquiry topic? So this might be quotes or paraphrasing, or it might be sort of describing what's going on in the image source. Then we're going to bring in our own knowledge. A good way to do this is to say whether or not the contents of the source is accurate. So you can sort of say, what the source is, so paraphrasing it or describing what it says. And then you can say, I know this to be true because, bring your own knowledge, or my own knowledge contradicts this, or historical facts contradicts what the source is, and then bring in your factual knowledge. So this will be, stats, individuals, dates, places, all that kind of good stuff. Then we want to look at the provenance of the source. So as I mentioned before, this is the bit of text that is above the source. So it's really important that you look at that. You don't just ignore that and go straight to the source. The thing to think about with the provenance are the author's background, beliefs and experiences, the context of when and where they are writing and the information available to them, and the purpose and intended audience. So for example, the purpose is super important because, as I mentioned earlier, for example, if you've got a newspaper article or if it's a novel, for example, the author might be overemphasizing or exaggerating what happened in order to entertain. Whereas if you've got perhaps a photograph, that could be potentially more accurate because it's actually showing a snapshot of what was actually happening. A really important thing when you're talking about the provenance is not to just say the author is biased. The examiner knows all authors will be slightly biased with their background and beliefs. The important thing is why they are biased. So it's really important that if you think that might affect the usefulness of the source, you need to talk about why perhaps they are biased or how their backgrounds and beliefs would affect their kind of judgment. Another really important thing to think about when you're doing this question is thinking about sources' usefulness and also sources' accuracy. So just because a source is not accurate, so for example, you've got a propaganda poster that is completely sensationalizing something that happened or completely, saying something that's really untrue and not accurate of that we know of, it still can be useful to historians. So it can still be useful because we know that what the government was trying to portray, we know what citizens were perhaps taking in and how that might have skewed citizens' approaches and views during that time. So even though a source is not technically accurate, it might still be useful when studying a particular topic. And then, your final paragraph needs to look really closely at the usefulness of the sources. So in this paragraph, we need to make a clear overall judgment on the usefulness of both sources for the inquiry. So for example, you can say something like, therefore, sources B and C are extremely or somewhat or very useful to historians studying the topic because it's really good to sort of, as I mentioned, often sources are perhaps only somewhat useful on their own, but often with these kind of questions, bringing the sources together and looking at both sources together is really useful for a historian, and often it will help kind of show them two sides of the story or what kind of the government and the general public were thinking, or those kind of things. You might also want to say that perhaps the sources are useful, however, a historian might want to kind of expand the sources that they are using for the inquiry, because obviously only 2 sources are not going to give you the whole picture of what happened. Okay, so let's have a look at an example question and answer for this question type. So our question is, how useful are sources B and C to a historian studying the Berlin Wall? So already we know what our topic is going to be, it's the Berlin Wall. Explain your answer using sources B and C and your contextual knowledge. So again, the question's telling us what we need to have in our answer. So we need to have content from both of the sources, but we also need to bring in our historical knowledge about the Berlin Wall. So here are our 2 sources. Again, feel free to pause the video if you want to have a bit of a closer look. But basically this source is a cartoon that deplores the attitude of Walter Ulbricht, the first secretary of the East German Communist Party, who ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall. Lang describes this as the cutting. So you can see here it depicts the first secretary with a scythe kind of rounding people up there. And then our source C is a response to the US State Department from the Soviet Foreign Minister discussing the Berlin Wall. And this is basically the Soviet Foreign Ministry are basically defending why they built the wall and talking about how it was to, reduce the subversive activity and espionage and that kind of thing. So those are our 2 sources. Oops. So let's take a look at our example answer for this question. So you can see here we've got the 3 paragraphs, one on source B, one on source C, and then our overall judgment on the usefulness of both sources together. So first of all, we give our evidence. So this is the evidence from the sources, so the content of the sources. So we're showing that source B is useful because it shows Ulbricht using a communist scythe to violently prevent East Germans from escaping, suggesting the wall was a tool of oppression. Then we're going to bring in our own knowledge. So this is supported by contextual knowledge, and then we're, talking about the Berlin Wall and how it was a major crisis, trying to stop the mass emigration, introducing harsher border security, and all of that kind of thing. And then finally, we need to talk about the provenance. So about, the background, perhaps the author, or how this might affect its usefulness or reliability. So we're talking about, however, the source's provenance limits its reliability. As a Western political cartoon, it was designed to criticise communism and stir public opinion against the East, so it exaggerates and oversimplifies, ignoring East Germany's political and economic reasons for building the wall. And it's a great way to kind of use provenance to discuss the usefulness of the source as well, because often the provenance will mean that perhaps the source is not quite as accurate or perhaps not as reliable, so it's a great way to sort of bring in your judgment when you're talking about provenance. And then we just need to do the same thing for source C. So again, we're giving our evidence, so we're talking about what the source includes. So it's useful because it provides the Soviet Union's official justification for the Berlin Wall, claiming it was necessary to prevent subversive activity and espionage from Western Berlin. So you can see there we've added a quote. You don't have to add loads and loads of quotes, you can just kind of paraphrase as well, that's absolutely fine. Then we want to bring in our own knowledge. So again, we're bringing lots and lots of own knowledge here. So talking about how this does reflect Cold War tensions, how West Berlin was a centre for Western influence and broadcasting into the East, which East Germany saw as a threat. And then we can also obviously use our own knowledge to perhaps say why the source is not so accurate. However, my own knowledge shows that the primary reason for the wall was to stop the brain drain, weakening the East German economy, rather than purely stopping espionage, which reduces the source's accuracy. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about the provenance. So the provenance, an official Soviet response, makes it valuable for understanding how the Soviets presented their actions to the world. However, its diplomatic purpose means it downplays the repressive nature of the wall and falsely claims the measures were temporary, making the source biased and self-serving. So you can see there, we've said that it's biased, but we've explained why it's biased and made sure that the examiner knows that we understand how that's made it biased. Okay, and then in our final paragraph, we are just looking at both the sources together and talking about their usefulness together. So overall, sources B and C are useful because they offer an important insights into both the Western and Soviet views on the Berlin Wall. Source B highlights the perception of repression, while source C explains the communist defence of the wall as necessary for security. Their biases, Western propaganda and Soviet diplomacy, limit their reliability individually. However, used together, they provide a balanced understanding of the Cold War tensions surrounding Berlin. So you can see there we've sort of recognise that each source individually perhaps is not very accurate and reliable, but together it gives a good picture of both sides of the argument. And then finally, they do not explain the full cost of the war, such as divided families and the deaths of those trying to escape, so a historian would need to consult other sources, such as eyewitness accounts, to gain a complete picture. And that's a really good thing to add at the end, just to show the examiner that we know that even though the sources are useful, a historian would need to look elsewhere in order to get a full picture of the, if they were studying the Berlin Wall. And that is our question 2. Okay, so let's look at question 3. So question 3 is write an account of, and that is worth 8 marks. So for this question, you need to write 3 Peel paragraphs focusing on 3 key events relating to the topic or theme in the question. This question tests your ability to write about causes and consequences. You should not only tell your examiner what happened, but why each event happened and how it led to the next event. You also need to make sure that you are writing in chronological order, so your first paragraph should be the event that came first, and so on. So for this question, I suggest writing 3 Peel paragraphs, so making your point, so the first, second, final key event of the event in question was, making sure to write about the events in the order that they happened. Then you want to bring in your evidence, so your historical knowledge, stats, places, names, dates, all that kind of thing. Then you want to explain, so you need to show how this evidence links to your point and the event in the question. And then finally, you want to link back to the event to ensure you're keeping a focus on the question. Okay, so let's have a look at an example question and answer for this. So our question is, write an account of how the Prague Spring affected development of the Cold War. So we exactly know what we need to be focusing on is the Prague Spring. So here is our answer. So you can see here I've got my 3 Peel paragraphs. For this question, you don't really need to add an introduction or a conclusion or anything like that. You can just get straight into it with your paragraphs. So first of all, I have shown my point. So firstly, the Prague Spring affected the development of the Cold War because it challenged Soviet control in Eastern Europe. So that's what our first point is looking at. Then we're going to give our evidence, so explaining kind of what happened during the Prague Spring. So in April 1968, Alexander Dubček introduced reforms in Czechoslovakia that gave people more political freedom, including ending censorship. Then we're going to explain how this affected development of the Cold War. So this allowed criticism of communism and encouraged calls for more change. Although Dubček said he would keep Czechoslovakia in the Warsaw Pact, Brezhnev saw the reforms as a threat to Soviet influence. And then we're just finally doing a quick link back to the question. This increased Cold War tensions by showing that Eastern European countries wanted more independence from Moscow. And that is our first paragraph. You obviously don't need to do quite as much sort of evidence and explanation as you would for perhaps a 16 marker, which we'll look at next, but you still need to make sure that you're hitting all of the key points. Okay, so our next point. These reforms greatly concerned the Soviets as Dubček allowed non-communist political parties to be set up, undermining communist rule. And you can see we've kind of linked both the paragraphs together, so we can, you can start your paragraphs by kind of saying this led to this, or because of this, this happened. So it's really good because it's an account, so you're kind of giving a story of what happened. You need to sort of link each paragraph together and show how each thing kind of led to the other. Then we're giving our evidence. So in August 1968, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia with 500,000 troops from other Warsaw Pact states. And the Czechs did not fight back and used peaceful protest tactics. Then we're going to explain how this affected the development of the Cold War. So this resulted in Dubček being removed from power and the reforms on the Prague Spring were lost. And then finally, linking back to the question. So showing that the USSR would not tolerate deviation from communism, increasing East-West tensions and reinforcing divisions. And then finally, we just need to do this a third time with our final point. So after the Prague Spring, Brezhnev introduced the Brezhnev Doctrine, giving our evidence about what the Brezhnev Doctrine was and what it did. Then we're going to explain how this affected the development of the Cold War, meaning that the satellite states trying to introduce reforms or break away from Moscow would face another Prague Spring-style crackdown. And then we're just linking it back to the question finally. So this significantly increased Cold War tension by confirming Soviet willingness to use military force to maintain control, discouraging reform across the Eastern Bloc. So there are our 3 paragraphs for question 3. Okay, and then for our final question in paper 1 section B, this is our large 16 marker, which is a how far do you agree question. For this question as well, you will be getting 4 marks for SPAG. So make sure that you are reading through your answer, double checking all of your spelling, punctuation and grammar, because you obviously want to try and get those 4 marks. For this question, you'll be given a statement and asked how far you agree with it. So often it will sort of state something like, this was the main reason for this, or this was the main cause of this. And then you need to write 3 Peel paragraphs, each on a separate point or factor. So perhaps you can write your first paragraph about the factor in the statement, and then 2 other paragraphs on different factors. So yeah, we've got our 3 Peel paragraphs, and then I do also recommend that you do write a conclusion for this question, just because it's a judgment question. You want to really sum up what you've said and make sure that the examiner knows exactly what your judgment is. Okay, so for your paragraphs, you want to firstly introduce your point. So firstly, I agree or disagree with the statement because. You can also say, however, a historian might argue this, or it can be argued that such and such. Then you want to bring in your evidence. So as always, providing relevant and precise historical evidence. And for this question, it's really important that you make sure that your evidence is relevant to the fact that you're talking about. It's no good kind of talking about random facts and figures from across the topic that's not really relevant to your factor. You need to make sure that it's very relevant to your point. Then you need to explain. So using your evidence, you need to explain why the factor supports or does not support the statement. And then you always need to link back to the question. So this gives you a chance to sort of add a mini judgment at the end of each paragraph, just so the examiner knows exactly where your kind of conclusion is headed and exactly what your judgment is. So therefore, I agree or disagree with the statement because, and then even if you're writing about perhaps other factors, you could add in at the bottom end of that paragraph, however, I still agree or disagree with the statement because, so you're sort of still reinforcing what you think and making sure the examiner is not going to be surprised at your conclusion at the end. And then finally our conclusion is just to briefly explain how far you agree with the statement. So you're sort of just summing up your points and stating what you think the most important factor was. Okay, so let's look at an example question and answer for this one. So for this question, our statement is, the main reason for increased tensions between the USA and the USSR in the years 1945 to 49 was the Berlin blockade. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. So you can see here already we have got our dates, so we need to make sure that we're sticking between these dates. We've got our factor, which is the Berlin blockade, and the topic is reasons for increased tensions. So for our answer, we have got our 3 paragraphs, so 3 Peel paragraphs, each on a different factor, and then our short conclusion at the end. Again, for this question, I don't really think you need an introduction. You can just go straight ahead with your first paragraph. Okay, so first of all, we are giving our judgment and giving our first point. So for this question, I am agreeing with the statement, so I've started off straight away with my judgment. Firstly, I agree that the Berlin blockade was a key reason for increased tensions between the USA and the USSR. For this kind of question, I would always suggest that you do have a judgment or you do have an opinion. So instead of sort of saying, I partially agree with the statement or I half agree with the statement, I think it's often a lot easier for the examiner when they're marking your answer to see that you either agree or disagree. I think it's best to sort of, obviously you can still say that the other factors were still important. Obviously that's not stating that your other factors were not important, but I think being able to say distinctively, I agree or I disagree with the statement really helps show that you've got a justified conclusion and that you've kept your judgment throughout and it's not like wishy-washy, because otherwise the examiner might get a little bit confused and not quite know what your stance is. Okay, then we're going to bring in our historical evidence. So you can see here I have got our dates, talked about how Stalin cut access to the land in West Berlin, talking about the Berlin airlift, all that kind of thing. Then we're going to explain how this increased tensions between the USA and the USSR. So a good way to always ensure that you are bringing your explanation in is to literally just start your sentence after your evidence with this increased tensions because that really shows the examiner that you've got your evidence and now you're explaining why that is significant. So here we've just stated this worsened tension significantly because it turned the Cold War rivalry into open confrontation and showed both sides were willing to stand firm. So that is our explanation. And then we're just adding in our link. So just making sure that we're really sticking to the question and we're also keep reiterating our judgment so the examiner knows exactly what we think. We're just ending it with, therefore, the blockade significantly worsened tensions as it humiliated Stalin and made future cooperation between the superpowers increasingly unlikely. And that is our first paragraph, so we just need to do the same again for two other factors. So we're bringing in our point. So here I've started it with, however, a historian may argue that the atomic bomb was an even more significant factor in the early development of tensions. So there is our next factor, is the atomic bomb. We're giving our evidence, so talking about how the USA tested their first atomic bomb without informing Stalin about the atomic bombs in Japan and how this alarmed Stalin and who he felt threatened by the USA. Then we're going to explain why this increased tension, so we're just reiterating that this arms race increased mistrust and fear in the superpowers as both sides prepared for the possibility of nuclear war. And then finally, we're just still linking back to the question. So as I mentioned earlier, here's a really great way to bring in your judgment once again. So you can see here I've said, however, I still agree that the main reason for increased tensions was the Berlin blockade, as this was the first time tensions turned into direct confrontation, forcing both sides to take action that reshaped global politics. So you can see there that although I've obviously explained why the atomic bomb was an important factor, I'm still reiterating the fact that I actually still think that the Berlin blockade was the most important reason. Okay, and then finally we're doing our final point. So finally it can be argued that the Truman Doctrine also played a major role. As always, we're giving our evidence, so we're talking about what the Truman Doctrine did. We're going to explain, so we're explaining how this increased tension, so how the USSR saw it as an attempt to interfere in its sphere of influence, and then it responded with Cominform and Comecon. And finally, we are linking back to the question and linking back to our judgment. So, however, I still agree that the Berlin blockade was the main reason because it moved the Cold War from ideological and economic rivalry to a physical standoff, forcing the world to take sides and creating alliances that would shape the Cold War for decades. So you can see here, yeah, it's a really good way. You can also kind of bring in, like, for example, I think that, this was the main however, I still think this was the main reason because without this, that might not have happened. So yeah, it's always a good idea to sort of keep linking back to your judgment and keep making sure that the examiner knows exactly what you think. And then finally, we've got our conclusion. So this, again, as I said, shouldn't be a surprise to the examiner. It should just reiterate and sum up what you've already said, just so they're finishing off reading your answer and knowing exactly where you stand. So overall, I agree that the Berlin blockade was the main reason for increased tensions between the USA and the USSR. You could also mention your factors, so you can say, although the atomic bomb and the Truman Doctrine contributed, it was the Berlin blockade that brought these tensions into direct confrontation. So we're just reiterating that, although the other factors were also important, the main reason was the Berlin blockade. Okay, so now it is your turn. I will link some of our 16-mark questions below on all of the wider world depth studies topics, and you'll be able to have a go at those online and get instant AI marks and feedback to see how well you have applied the exam technique. But yeah, good luck with your revision, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!